Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Weird Chronicles. Each episode, we bring you tales of action and adventure from Malifaux and the other side. The monks of the Fermented River are some of the finest distillers in Malifaux, and no liquor is more storied than song, an intoxicating drink with flavours of burnt cream, honeyed oatmeal, and fresh pine. But the monks are not the only denizens in Malifaux with a taste for song. I hope you enjoy Singing Song.
Singing Song by Stacey Zend. This is a stupid idea. No, it's not. It's genius. It seems like a stupid idea to me. Oh, what's your idea, Bao? Not this. Stay here and drink what we got? Shush and get the shoes. The shoes is important. Bao lifted the gaiter in his paws and clicked a claw against the wood, frowning doubtfully. We're going to tie them on? I am, yes, Nobu curtly said, then gestured for the shoes. Is important. They'll see the bottom and hear the clicks. Click-clack, sound like monk. Is perfect. Big bushy tails twitched and waved behind them as they readied for their quest. Minions of the brewmaster, these tanuki had been instructed to get a hold of a sample of the mysterious brew song. They never bothered to learn why or even thought to ask. Being instructed to steal some rare ale was enough to pique their collective interests. After all, where there's a sample, there's a source. Which might as well have meant an endless supply. They were stout little roof hoppers who currently resided in a small, delicious-smelling attic above a rundown restaurant. The place was cluttered with old dusty chairs and boxes of supplies. The tanuki had set up their 3 little bedrolls in the far corner, away from the eyes of anyone who might need an extra soup bowl. The early evening light peeked through the broken window, slowly slipping away into the night. Nobu quickly lashed the shoes to Daichi's small paws. Daichi wobbled as his feet adjusted, then stabilized and straightened with a triumphant smile. He placed his fists on his fat, furry hips. I'm tall, he beamed. Daichi, all tan save for a large black spot around his right eye, was the shortest of the 3. He was also the heftiest, which is why he'd been instructed to take the bottom position. The wooden shoes elevated him several inches. Nobu looked up at him, satisfied. About as tall as you are round, he teased. And even taller once you has Bao and me up there. He beckoned to the dubious tanuki, who waddled over with a sigh. Bao was a dark shade of tan, with black ears and round black patches around his eyes, referred to by the others as his specs. While it was generally accepted that he was the smartest of the 3, mostly a circumstance of how he looked, his wisdom was nearly always overruled by Nobu, their self-proclaimed leader. With a great deal of grunting and an awkward scramble from the 2 tanuki, they eventually managed to hoist Bao onto Daichi's shoulders. Daichi had trouble with the shoes for a moment, but kept from toppling over. Nobu smiled up at Bao. Perfect. Nobu was not only the tallest of the 3, being just over 2 feet, but he also had the best nose of the group. A thin black stripe ran up his snout and out to his ears. He called it his arrow. It meant, he frequently claimed, that his nose would flawlessly point him wherever he needed, when in reality, his markings were about as meaningful as Bao's, and that is to say, they were not meaningful at all. This isn't going to work, Bao said, as he peered down at Daichi. You want song or not? Nobu questioned. Yeah, do you? Daichi chimed in. Bao really did. He was tired of the swill they'd been drinking the last few weeks, so he said nothing. His mouth watered just thinking about a chance to taste the fermented river monk's secret brew. His nose twitched as he imagined the smell of it. You's drooling, Nobu snickered. Bao wiped his chin. Nobu giggled and turned to grab the river monk coat from the upturned chair nearby. He wasn't willing to disclose to the others how he'd managed to get a hold of the shoes and garments, answering only with a coy smirk and the phrase, I has my ways. To Bao, That sounded suspiciously like he took it from one of the restaurant patrons, which would explain the shouting about dagnab fat raccoons stealing my gosh darn clothes from the night before. "Hold these," Nobu instructed, pushing the coat, false arms, and a large liquor gourd into Daichi's stubby arms. He then scrambled his way up Daichi's back and onto Bao's, who grunted in response. "You are as heavy as Daichi," Bao grunted, as Nobu pulled on his ear as leverage to hoist himself up. "You wish," Daichi managed, as he worked to keep his balance. The large coat was passed up the ladder made of tanuki once Nobu settled on Bao's shoulders. Nobu then swung it around them and pushed the long sleeves up so he could fasten all of the jacket's buttons before receiving the gourd and pulling it over his shoulder. "I can't see," Bao said. "You're not supposed to. Fix the coat all straight." They wiggled until the fabric of the coat straightened. Nobu looked down at their creation, a lumpy, tangled mess of tanuki perfection. "There," he declared as he straightened his broad hat. He reached down for the false arms, which were made of long straw bundles and twigs with stuffed gloves on the ends. Nobu held on to each bundle and bent his wrists. Inside the coat, the arms bent close enough to the elbow to be passable, he hoped. The coat was wide enough that the lumps appeared to be in the right places, and was long enough that only the bottom of the wooden shoes were visible, but the twine holding them to Daichi's little paws wasn't. "If we come across any monks," Nobu told Bao, "I'll just keep my head down so the hat covers my face." "And what if they try to talk to us?" Bao asked incredulously. "Have you thought of what to do then?" Nobu shrugged. "We look like we is in a hurry. I can say stuff like, 'What is the deal with the guild?' and 'Why didn't the Chiangong hire the resurrectionist? He wasn't that lively.' See, I fit right in, just won't make eye contact." "This is a stupid idea," Bao repeated, "and you are a stupid tanuki." "Shush, we's almost ready. Daichi, how's the eye holes working?" He might have called them eye holes, but they were barely slits positioned in front of the bottom tanuki's eyes. "Good," Daichi said, squinting as he peeked out. In truth, his vision was fuzzy at best, but it was about the same as after a night of heavy drinking. "Good," Nubo said. "We all ready?" They each took a moment to imagine what song was going to taste like. Daichi hoped it would be fruity and floral. Bao imagined that sweet, warm sting. Nobu yearned for a smoky flavor. All three drew in a breath and sighed longingly. They made a tour around the attic to allow Daichi to adjust to walking with two passengers on his shoulders while wearing odd shoes on his feet, not to mention his limited visibility. He bumped into a few pieces of furniture and giggled each time. He stubbed his toe against a dusty canister and fell into it, which pushed Bao face first into the glass. This also gave Daichi a good chuckle. When they were satisfied, and once Daichi had stopped laughing, they descended from their attic and walked through the restaurant while acting like a long-lost patron. As they gracefully crossed Little Kingdom, the sun had completely disappeared against the horizon. The streetlights hardly offered any light at all. Their dull yellow glows barely illuminated the ground beneath them. Nobu kept his head down and an eye out, but most folks seemed to be too preoccupied with their own shady business and didn't care enough to notice the tall, wobbly monk. A couple of street vendors tried to call for their attention, but Nobu awkwardly waved an arm their way in response. A few foul remarks followed them, which caused Daichi to giggle again. Bao dug his claw into Daichi's shoulder to smother the laughter, but it couldn't be helped. They eventually, miraculously, made their way toward the temple of the fermented river monks. The tanuki didn't see anyone out around the building, but then again, they barely bothered to look. A quick glance was good enough for them. "Stop for a minute," Nobu murmured. Daichi paused. "What is it?" Bao asked from his place in the middle, unable to see. "We is here," Nobu told him. "Okay. What now?" "We has to find a door." "A what?" "A door." Bao would have smacked his head if he could have moved his arms. "You don't know how to get in?" "Sure I does. Through a door." "We just needs a door," Daichi agreed cheerily. "This is—" "Don't say stupid again, Bao," Nobu interrupted. "Isn't helpful." Dumb. And you are dumb, Bao lamented. Find one then. Thank you. Daichi, keep going. Around to the right. They worked their way along the wall, stepping over what they hoped were pools of water, until they found a wooden side door that barely hung to its hinges, holding on more to the lock than the doorframe. Here, see? Nobu sneered. Lucky, Bao responded, for which he was hushed by both Nobu and Daichi. Nobu tipped his hat up and looked around to make sure they were alone. Past the building was a long stretch of trees, and beyond those was a slow, gurgling river. Almost directly behind where they stood was an old rickety bridge that barely managed to cross the river. To their luck, no one seemed to be nearby. Nobody but the pair of monks that were walking towards the bridge that they didn't notice. Bao, he whispered. Pick the lock. We is alone. Please, Bao muttered, then pushed a couple buttons open to reach through the coat and work the shoddy lock. Behind them, the gentle tapping of shoes against wood echoed menacingly. Nobu span around to the bridge and spotted the pair of shadowy figures crossing the bridge, seemingly appearing out of thin air. Hurry, he spat. Please hurry, Bao mocked as the lock clicked open. The pair on the bridge paused. Nobu, after being unable to tell which direction the figures were facing, hastily swung back around toward the door as it swung open. Is a hallway, Nobu whispered, loud enough for it to not be a whisper at all. He turned his head either way several times before he added, is empty. He glanced back at the bridge and saw the figures reaching for their sides, which could have held either flasks or daggers, but certainly not both. It was still unclear whether they'd noticed the stacked tanuki fiddling with the door. Daichi, go! Quickly! Daichi pushed through the door, swinging his shoulders forward so that both Nobu and Bao face-planted against the wooden floor. After Nobu adjusted his whiskers, he used one of the bundles that formed the fake arm and shut the door behind them. Bao then locked it, or at least he tried to. It no longer hung on the hinges and instead rested against the frame. Good enough for a tanuki, though. Which way? Daichi whispered, and Nobu spent a moment sniffing the air. That, he finally said, pointing right. Which? That. Oh, for goodness, he can't see you, Nobu, Bao interrupted. Oh, when you're right, you're right. Right. Go right. Right now. Daichi peered through the slits and stumbled down the dimly lit hall, following Nobu's nose and intuition. The whole place smelled like different stages of fermentation, and some stages smelled better than others, but they'd been following Nobu long enough to trust his sense of smell, and at this point didn't have much of a choice in the matter. Each hallway they entered was darker than the last, which Nobu was thankful for, as they relied on the poor lighting to blend in. Most of the doors they passed were shut, and were impossible to open with the twig hands, but eventually they found an open one that led to what looked like a training room for monks to spar. At least that's what it looked like the monks were doing. With their unique drunken style, they could have just as easily been trying to stand up straight. Nobu murmured to Daichi to pause for a moment, so that he could take a closer peek inside. The monks moved in loose sways and staggers, as though they had no control over their bodies, induced by the song in their systems. But as they sparred, they were sparring, right? They landed wild punches and kicks against one another, suggesting a much higher level of mastery than it appeared. As the stacked trio moved on and continued to wander the halls, they found other doors open to brewing rooms where monks assisted their concoctions along the various fermentation and brewing stages. There was even a tasting room, easily the most crowded room, from which explosions of laughter and rowdy praise emanated. The tanuki grinned as they passed. Even Bao, who couldn't see. Their taste buds tingled all the more boisterously for their own chance to savor the brew themselves. They then passed a drunken monk wandering the halls by himself, who swayed, staggered, and sang a nonsensical limerick repeatedly. He tipped his hat to the disguised tanuki, but his attention never strayed from the floor at the risk of it sliding out from underneath him. Until he vanished around the corner and out of sight, all 3 little tanuki hearts hammered away. Around the next bend, they passed a monk who slept in the center of the floor. Daichi masterfully tiptoed around his limbs, while snickering at the drunken monk's snoring pattern. The man snored like a distant train. Choo, choo, but didn't stir. More terrifyingly, they crossed paths with a pair who appeared sober enough to stand, but they were busy having a heated discussion. One gestured wildly as he ranted, raising his voice a little more every time the other tried to interrupt. Daichi walked very, very carefully, as not to trip and spill the 3 of them onto the floor. Bao, blinded by the coat, but able to hear the argument growing closer and closer, held his breath and stayed statue still. His back claws dug into Daichi's shoulders to keep as stable as possible. Nobu, the only visible one, kept his head down behind his conical hat to hide his furry face, and gave a small nod to the pair. He received absently delivered waves in response. If either noticed something amiss, they didn't stop their argument to comment. After they reached a safe distance beyond the 2 monks, Nobu and Bao let out their breath. Daichi burped, then giggled. It felt as though they'd been wandering through the temple for ages, seemingly around more corners than there were walls. Was it a maze, or were they just confused and ended up wandering down the same halls? It was impossible for at least 2 of them to tell. "We're getting close," Nobu whispered, as he trembled with excitement on top of Bao's shoulders. They eventually found a series of stairs, upon which they decidedly descended down them, then down 2 more, through 2 more halls, and passed by 1 more sleeping monk. "You are lost. We are lost," Bao sourly whispered. "Hush. I can't has my belly gabbing at me. I is concentrating." "That way, Daichi." The tanuki finally rounded a corner, and the aromatic smell of alcohol washed over all 3. 2 laughing monks emerged from a door, each carrying large gourds with both hands, ignorant to the awkwardly swaying stack of tanuki. By the way the monks were carrying them, the gourds looked heavy. Nobu grinned wickedly. Bao tipped his head up so that his nose could catch the aroma. Daichi drooled. The pair of monks took their gourds straight across the hall and through an open door, from which a cacophony of cheers emerged. Nobu whispered for Daichi to follow the monks down the hall, which he reluctantly did after wiping the slobber from his mouth. Nobu peered into the open door and saw 6 men sitting around a large table. They passed one of the gourds around to fill their large tankards, laughing as they played a card game. "Okay, now turn around. Go to the closed door," Nobu whispered. Daichi turned to carefully approach the direction from which the succulent smell poured. There was no handle on this door, likely because those going in and out often had their hands full. Nobu glanced over his shoulder through the open door and across the hall. Thankfully, none of the card players had noticed them wandering about. "Let's go," Nobu whispered. Bao nudged the door's edge with his makeshift arms, and Daichi responded by carrying them through. It was truly a beautiful sight for Nobu and Daichi. A room lined with barrels, and each barrel filled with their prize. For Bao, he noticed only the pungent aroma, for the air was thick with a combination of burnt cream, oatmeal, and pine, the smell of song. There were wooden frame stands designed for holding large barrels on either side of the room. The song was stored 2 rows deep, a dozen barrels long and 4 barrels high. To the tanuki, that might just be enough for the night. They pulled open the coat, and Nobu scrambled out of it. He jumped from Bao's shoulders and landed on the ground, with his hands on his chubby hips. "I told you," Nobu exclaimed in a hushed tone. Bao grinned and descended from Daichi's shoulders. "There's so much," Daichi squealed under his breath as he clapped his paws. "Quickly," Nobu whispered. "Let's fill the gourd and go out the way we came." Daichi frowned. "But they have barrels. Barrels! 1 gourd won't do." Bao didn't respond. He was too busy hugging a barrel like a loved one. "Gourd first, job first," Nobu reluctantly argued. He pulled the large gourd from his back as Daichi gathered the coat. The three of them shuffled towards the back corner of the room to the second row of barrels, so if anyone came in for a restock, the tanuki wouldn't be seen. When they rounded the first row of barrels, they expected to find funnels, valves, corks, and perhaps the occasional wandering drunk. Instead, what they found surprised even Bao. 2 gremlins stood on top of the second barrel on a rack. One with a faded sombrero that hung on his back, and the other wore a top hat with more holes than the gremlin had teeth. A third gremlin, who wore a straw hat that he'd likely made himself and was hoisted on the sombrero-wearing gremlin's shoulders, was in the process of tapping into a barrel himself. All 3 of them had 2 jugs attached to their hips and drool dripping from their mouths. As the straw hat gremlin squirmed and adjusted himself so that he could get a better angle, his hat tipped backwards. With his eyesight no longer obstructed, he looked blankly at Daichi, Bao, and Nobu. The 2 groups blinked at each other. Then they exchanged glances among their own. Then they looked back to the others and blinked again. Nobu gathered himself first. He set his gourd aside, puffed out his chest, drew in his round belly, and stepped forward. So as not to alert the monks, he pointed a claw at the gremlins as menacingly as he could and gestured in the direction of the door with a furrowed brow. Nobu's expression could only mean one thing: get out of here. The gremlins looked at each other again. The straw hat gremlin leapt off the top hat gremlin's shoulders and stepped forward. He drew himself up with a long inhale so that he towered over Nobu. He shook his head, pointed to the tanuki and then to the door, which clearly meant, no, you get out of here. Nobu raised his eyebrows in shock and pointed to himself and then to the floor. We were here first. The gremlin shook his head again with an incredulous expression. He responded by pointing to the ground, then to himself, and finally waving an arm towards his comrades behind him. He signaled, no, obviously we were. Nobu signaled to the door again and crossed his arms, settling back stubbornly. The gremlin raised an eyebrow and mirrored the gesture. They seemed to find themselves at an impasse, but a roar of laughter from across the hallway reminded them that they were all intruders. Nobu looked at the other 2 tanuki, who shrugged and gestured him forward. The lead tanuki nodded, gathered his bearings, stepped forward, and slapped the leader of the gremlins across the face with a wet thwap. Daichi held in his laughter while Bao wondered how the monks playing cards didn't hear that. The gremlin blinked, his jaw agape. The 2 behind him looked just as taken aback and eagerly waited for his reaction. His face changed from shock to determination. He then reared his own hand back to slap Nobu. The tanuki ducked at the perfect moment. 5 green fingers skimmed his conical hat and knocked it askew against his right cheek. The gremlin in the sombrero snickered, and Daichi hissed a shush at him. The straw hat gremlin sneered. A moment of silence struck between the 2, thick enough to be cut with a knife, and then the groups exploded into one another like a silent bomb went off. Daichi and the sombrero gremlin jumped at each other and met halfway in a scramble of smacks and slaps. Thanks to his longer arms, the sombrero gremlin landed more successful hits, but Daichi managed to knock him back with an outward push of his stomach. Bao lunged to tackle the top hat gremlin, but he missed, diving well over his green shiny head. The gremlin with the top hat dove after Bao and missed as well, having miscalculated his jump by a few feet. They repeated this leapfrogging until they finally connected, each surprised and somewhat disappointed that they actually had to start fighting. Nobu corrected his conical hat on his head and glowered at the leading gremlin with the straw hat. The gremlin smirked back at him, and a metaphorical tumbleweed drifted by them with a faint whistle before the 2 commenced in their own slap grapple. The claws of the tanuki gave their smacks a little more burn, but the gremlins were quick and managed to dodge more often. All the while, the 6 thieves tried not to make any noises that would attract the attention of the card players nearby. Their grunts were strained and soundless as their scrambles were fast but careful. Daichi stomped on Sombrero Goblin's foot with a gaiter, grinding the wooden edge down on the green toes. The gremlin's muffled cry puffed out his cheeks, but Daichi slapped a hand against his inflated face, and the air sprayed out with a soft pff. The top hat gremlin continued to battle with Bao, who was on top of him and trying to claw at his green face. The gremlin's arms were longer, and Bao wielded his in an attempt to reach the goblin's non-existent nose. Not making any progress that way, Bao chopped his hand against the inside of the gremlin's elbow, forcing his arm to collapse. With the window of opportunity, Bao rapidly smacked his face. Nobu and the straw hat gremlin both craned their heads back to stay out of range as they simultaneously tried to slap with one hand and bat away incoming slaps with the other. The door to the room slid open. In an instant, mid-fight, all 6 of them froze, slaps half delivered, teetering mid-lunge, wobbling on gaiters and hats all askew. A giggling monk shuffled in and approached one of the barrels. The liquid sloshed into a new vessel, while the monk's lingering laughter never ceased. The 6 thieves stayed frozen, breath held, hidden by barrels as the monk refilled his mug and shuffled his way back out. As the door clunked shut behind him, the fight commenced as if it had never stopped. The straw hat gremlin stepped on Nobu's foot and then shoved, sending him sprawling back on the floor on top of the heaped coat. Nobu lashed out with a foot, kicking the gremlin in the belly, and then scrambled up while the gremlin was bent and wheezing. Nobu's feet tangled in the coat and was met with another slap to the face as he reached his feet. He staggered back and grumpily kicked the coat away, not noticing it sprawl out in front of the first row of barrels. Daichi's sombrero gremlin delivered a punch to the stomach, which was absorbed by the tanuki's substantial belly, and Daichi responded with the same maneuver, which proved to be more successful. He hushed the green creature again when it grunted. Bao sat on the top hat gremlin's chest and went through the pockets of his overalls as he tried, and failed, to push the tanuki off. The gremlin wiggled and squirmed, hissing protests he couldn't shout. The straw hat gremlin had his arms around Nobu's neck in a headlock, but the tanuki kicked back with his little clawed feet when the door opened again. This time, 2 monks came in. "Quick, fill it up already," one drunkenly giggled. I am," the other insisted. There was the familiar sound of liquid sloshing against the mug, and then the second monk spoke again. "Hey, what's this?" Both the gremlins and the tanuki heard uneven footsteps as the monk crossed the room. The monk then came into view around the corner as he stooped to pick up the coat. He straightened his back, inspected the fur-covered coat, then noticed the frozen gremlins and tanuki in his peripherals, still locked mid-combat. "Hey, what's the big eye?" Without a moment's notice, Bao leapt off the top hat gremlin and scampered toward the monk. Simultaneously, Nobu scurried up the rack of barrels and scuttled across them toward the other. As Bao scaled the monk like a mountain, Nobu jumped down and landed on the shoulders of the other monk, who was oblivious up until that point. "What?" he cried, but Nobu muffled him. Daichi and the straw hat gremlin careened into the legs of the first monk who found them, which sent the human sprawling onto his back. As he landed with a thud, he began to cry out, but the gremlin was there to stuff his dirty sock into the monk's mouth. Bao began to tie him up with some nearby twine as Nobu crawled over the second monk's shoulder, but the monk snatched the tanuki by the tail. He dragged Nobu around like a doll and tried to bring his other fist up for a swing. Nobu grabbed the monk's arm mid-punch, scrambled up to his shoulder, and delivered a swift kick to his head, knocking him unconscious. The arrow-faced tanuki jumped away and landed on all fours as the man fell like a sack of potatoes. After Nobu tied him up, the tanuki tried to drag both monks around the corner, but gave up halfway through and left them in the middle of the floor. Both the sombrero and top hat gremlins filled each jug and gourd with song from the barrel that the monks had previously tapped. The gremlin with the top hat tried to sling a gourd around his shoulders, but Nobu noticed and cleared his throat. The gremlin skulked, then plucked the gourd from his arm and tossed it in Nobu's direction. He gave the tanuki a distinct gotcha gesture, but Nobu only stuck his black-striped nose up into the air in response. The gremlins clipped their full jugs onto their belts as Nobu and Bao donned their deliciously heavy gourds around their shoulders. The top hat gremlin ran ahead of them to the door and peered out. "They're still playing," he whispered. Both the gremlins and the tanuki lined up behind him as he pointed down the hall. "Around that next corner is where the stairs to the sewers are," he said softly. They peered at the open door where the card players argued over the rules of the game in between long swigs. While the group of monks was in the middle of a bout of riotous laughter, the gremlins and tanuki slipped into the hall and ran to the other door. They scurried down the hall, and as Daichi scrambled behind in his getter, one of the card players emerged from the room with an empty gourd and spotted him. "Hey!" the monk shouted, then laughed, and finally gave a confused and concerned expression. His hand extended outward as though he was attempting to pet the tanuki. "You're real, right?" "Nope," Daichi said, before scrambling around the corner until he caught up to the group. "There's one coming," he puffed. They could all hear the commotion as the monk stumbled after them. "That door," the straw hat gremlin whispered hoarsely, pointing to a shut door halfway down the long hallway. But they managed only to scamper part way there when another door opened, and two monks emerged between the thieves and their escape. "They're everywhere," Daichi wailed as they skidded to a stop. The monks stared down at them, befuddled. The sombrero gremlin dashed ahead and dropped to slide between the first monk's legs and jumped up with a punch to the second monk, straight in the gut. The monk let out a grunt as he reached for the gremlin in a drunken stupor. Nobu and Bao rushed at the first. The former stayed low and the latter jumped to strike high. The monk loosely swayed as Bao missed, and the monk kicked out with the leg that Nobu intended to sweep, which caught Nobu in the side and threw him against the wall. Daichi moved in to grab that same leg and then yanked down. The monk, who was busy dodging Bao's next strike, yelped as the tanuki pulled him off his feet. Nobu shook away the cobwebs and the three tanuki ran for the sewer door, each jumping hard on the monk's stomach as they passed. The gremlins had taken care of the other monk, though it looked like a bruise was forming around Sombrero Gremlin's left eye. The monks that chased them slid around the corner, maneuvering more gracefully than their inebriation suggested. The six thieves dove for the door to the sewer and flew down the steps. It was a small stone room with a hole leading down into the sewer. There was a stench that made four of them cough and two of them laugh, but slowed none of them. A dim light poured out from the floor in the distance, and the thieves dove for it. The hole was a short drop. The sewer tunnel was damp, dark, and smelly, and narrow enough that they had to run in single file. But that didn't stop the gremlins and tanuki from taking off along the sludgy water with their spoils. Bao, who was last in line and behind a gremlin, reached forward and quietly plucked one of the jugs off his belt. They passed a few tunnel openings that branched off, and after a few bends and twists in the tunnel, the gremlin split off to the left and descended down a sloped tunnel with shouts and whoops that echoed off the walls. The tanuki then realized that they didn't actually know where they were or where they were headed. They skidded to a stop, but Daichi slid face first into the sludge. "Find a manhole," Nobu said as he looked around the tunnels for a ladder. "There," Daichi said, pointing with one hand and wiping sludge off his face with the other. Nobu and Bao carefully climbed the slippery ladder and stood side by side the last step. The two heaved the cover up a crack. They peered around the street and immediately recognized the block. The three had stayed in the attic of a pastry shop a few months ago, not far from where they stood, and it had been one of their favorite hideaways, so they knew the area and could find their way back to the restaurant. They emerged in the middle of the quiet street and replaced the manhole cover as delicately as possible, looked around to get their bearings, and scouted for any monks. They waddled and shuffled through the dark streets of the little kingdom, peering over their shoulders until they made their way back to their little run-down restaurant. The closer they drew, the hastier their pace. They all but ran up the stairs. Nobu set the large gourd in the middle of the room. With a wide grin, Bao plunked down the large jug he stole from the top hat gremlin. Daichi giggled, and set down one he'd taken as well. "We has a lot of song," Nobu snickered as Daichi went to retrieve their tankards. Nobu sloshed a large serving from one of the jugs to each of the cups, and the tanuki squatted in a circle and slurped in unison. It was heavenly, exquisite, perfect. Smoky like burnt cream, sweet and delicious like honeyed oatmeal, it sent a tingly warmth through their bellies. No wonder they practice drunken fighting, Bao murmured. I'd practice everything with this stuff. The others nodded in agreement. Daichi took a loud slurp and wiped his hand across his mouth. Goodness, it's so good. We can tell the brewmaster we got it in the morning, right? Nobu breathed in the aroma before taking another sip, then nodded. We has to go back to get more, he said. Maybe the recipe. Bao then spoke up. I told you it was a stupid idea. We could have snuck through the sewer. Nobu glowered over his cup. We has it, don't we? We do, Bao conceded. But maybe a less stupid plan next time. Nobu held up a finger and took a long drink. The less stupid plan is, he hiccuped, to do the same thing again. What? They will expect a sewer entrance, but they will not expect us to walk in a coat again. Doing the same is smarter. If that was true, Bao replied, then they wouldn't be expecting a sewer entrance again either. Daichi gently shushed them both with a clawed finger held to his lips. We have a lot of song, he whispered. Let's drink it till we sing. Bao and Nobu shrugged. The three raised their cups and then tilted them back to empty them.
That's it for another episode of the Weird Chronicles. Join us next time for more tales of action and adventure.